I'm with the California Workers' Compensation Institute, and we started getting interested in collecting data on pharmaceuticals, and particularly opioids, and the relationship on injured worker outcomes about 15 years ago. And some of that early work from the mid-2000s looked at the relationship between graduated opioid use and injured worker outcomes, and very consistent to what Gary and others on the panel have talked about. We found significant adverse effects as the morphine equivalent count got higher. We found significant compromised outcomes in terms of facilitating return to work and leading to multiple surgeries and the like. We also started looking at the prescribing patterns of physicians in California, and found that the top 3% of the prescribing physicians of opioids were generating almost 70% of all the prescriptions, and yet there was no difference in the case mix of injuries from those high prescribers when compared to the lower. So this sort of began to evolve our thinking in other areas, and I'm going to share with you just a few recent studies that we've been focusing on. Let's see. This is very consistent with what we've heard earlier from the other panelists. After a significant, tremendous advance increase in opioid use in the early 2000s, we seem to hit the high water mark around 2008, 2009, and since then there's been a very strong fall off in both the proportion of prescriptions and payments over this 10-year trend, 47% reduction in scripts and 52% reduction in payments. And we see this almost everywhere we look. And in our website, we have some apps for people to model different aspects of development and region within California to see how that fall off changes when we look at different combinations of injured workers. This slide represents a significant turning point in prescribing patterns in California. In 2015, well, prior to 2015, opioids were clearly the #1 therapeutic group being prescribed to injured workers. All that began to change and finally crossed over in 2015 when anti-inflammatories became the #1 drug prescribed in workers' compensation, again without an appreciable change in the case mix of injuries. Now, in terms of that decrease in opioid use, again, we see it just about everywhere we look at the data, from different development points of 3 months all the way out to 72 months. Very consistent reductions in use. Here we'll just look at 4 different indicators of the first 24 months of development. Here the likelihood of receiving that first opioid prescription over this 10-year trend at 24 months fell by almost 36%. This heat map represents the different microclimates, so to speak, within California, red being the greater likelihood of receiving that opioid prescription, green meaning significantly less. And here, when it just came to looking at getting that first prescription, it was much more likely in the Central Valley. When we switch to the average number of scripts for those receiving opioids, the regional map shifts again. It's much more likely to receive more prescriptions in the northern parts of the state. But overall, again, a 52% reduction in the average scripts in the first 24 months of development for California claims. Again, it cannot be explained by a change in the case mix of injuries. Shifting to morphine equivalents, here's where it really starts to get dramatic. The average morphine equivalents per prescription fell by 45%. And again, you're much more likely to receive higher morphine equivalents per prescription in the northern parts of the state. The most interesting thing for us California nerds is what's happening in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is seen as the nerve center of all manner of claim dysfunction. Their costs are higher, litigation is much higher. All manner of adverse effects seem to be centered in Los Angeles. This must represent the exception that proves the rule. Los Angeles has much lower rates of opioid use and much lower morphine equivalents when we control for case mix and other injured worker characteristics. The biggest change, however, was in the cumulative morphine equivalents per claim, a 73% reduction from the high water mark of almost 4,700 morphine equivalents in 2008 all the way down to 1,200. A big turnaround for our state. There were other complications that we tripped over in some of our research, looking here at polypharmacy. This is, I'm sure, a well-known dynamic to most of the people in this room. It's written up in some detail and described as the prescribing cascade and the complications that occur when you move from one prescription to multiple prescriptions. We began to look at this a couple of years ago and published a recent paper looking at the frequency of polypharmacy as well as opioids' role within polypharmaceuticals. What we found was almost 24% of claims with recent accident years had 3 or more prescriptions. And when we looked at the combinations, those with elevated or extreme risk, almost 13.5% contained dangerous combinations of opioids with muscle relaxants and other combinations. So this is another area of focus for ongoing research. I'll finish with a conflict that the California, I'm sure other jurisdictions have, with federal policy, and this concerns the Medicare set-aside program. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Medicare set-asides. This is a basic program that's been in play for several decades, and it was really designed to keep Medicare's interests front and center when paying for healthcare services for injured workers who have sort of aged into Medicare. The idea is to set aside significant funds to cover anticipated future medical costs once those injured workers age into Medicare. The federal program has very explicit rules for oversight on opioids, as well as setting up those set-asides. They basically look at the last 1 to 2 years of treatment and then ask you to set aside significant funds as if whatever happened in those 1 to 2 years in the final period of claim life were to continue until death do us part. We found this to be a significant issue when it came to opioids. So we gathered a large sample of Medicare set-asides that were approved and put into play by CMS for set-asides from January 2015 and December 2016, and we case matched those against similar permanent disability injuries that did not have a Medicare set-aside with the following results. We found that almost 70% of all those MSAs had an opioid component, and about 10% of those had set-asides that were equal to about 90 morphine equivalents a day. There were also significant populations of MSAs that had dangerous combinations of opioids with either hypnotics or muscle relaxants. The biggest finding that this paper developed was just the sheer volume of opioids within these MSAs. On average, across our sample, we found that the typical MSA called for about 3 doses a day at 54 morphine equivalents per day over a 21-year lifespan. And when we compared the cumulative morphine equivalents at the mean, they were 45 times higher than the control claims of similar injuries in permanent disability claimants that have no Medicare set-aside. So this is also the subject of ongoing work. We'll be refreshing these studies and looking into other areas of the opioid issue.
Thanks very much, Alex, for that presentation. Next